Welcome to another episode. So when I put up this poll on LinkedIn to see what topics people would be interested in me covering, I actually thought the social dilemma review would have been worn out by now in the months that people have been talking about it. But apparently there's still a lot of interest, probably because it's one of those problems that spans multiple areas of knowledge, and we all know is going to have a big impact on our personal lives as well as society, and it's still something we can't quite wrap our minds around. It's something that we can all think about and approach, and at the same time, nobody's really a true expert, and there's no researcher who has accounted for the total net impact that social media will have on our lives. So again, there's no way that we're going to do this justice in the time that we have, but because it was upvoted so much, I'll share my thoughts as a data scientist, as well as just a normal customer of these products. Let's begin. Like all social media, my first observation was that the message in Social Dilemma is overstated and produced to manipulate you, from the music to the visualizations. It kind of reminded me of Inception. So you kind of think of, when the main character is spinning this top to see if he's come back through all of the levels that they had gone into in the dream world. It makes me think of something very similar. Am I still in this manipulation cycle that they're talking about, or have I actually risen above the entire system? I also noticed a major failure to examine the trade-offs or any solutions. For example, one solution is to isolate kids from social media. But are kids who are isolated from social media going to have better lives? Or would any regulation be able to improve the situation? More importantly, what happens when the group of people inclined to watch the social dilemma and respond to the call to remove themselves from this part of society, as well as the engines that reflect them? It will be the people who are concerned enough about getting balanced information and those who fear echo chambers who ultimately make this decision. So then what happens when all of those people exit the system and stop influencing the recommendation algorithms as well as the others that they interact with online? I think that things will get worse and not better. Let's walk through some of the details. Overall, it's a good set of experts, though ultimately not a very diverse group, as you'll notice, even in terms of their thinking. Not everyone who works on these tools, the same tools that they worked on, feels the same way or has come to the same conclusions. And there's obviously nobody to represent the counterpoints in the documentary. So that's something that you'll have to research and look up yourself. Even at the beginning, those on the show struggled to explain what the problem is with any direct statements when asked.
So then what's the problem? Is there a problem, and what is the problem?
Yeah, it is hard to give a single succinct. I'm trying to touch on many different problems.
What is the problem?
This part I can actually get on board with because it's often the most destructive parts of a system that are also the most subtle, which is why they're able to sneak through and cause havoc. Anything that's obviously harmful is more often universally rejected. The next part of the video spends time driving home what is to be an obvious fact, that people are incredibly divided and the world is crazier than it's ever been before in history. All of this is meant to tee you up so that all of your concerns are ready to be cast onto social media when they point the finger. But is that really true? Have we been more divided? Another point argues that a small number of people now control information and manipulate large portions of the population, unlike any other time in history. But is that true? It's certainly not true from any fascist or communist regime that's existed in the past that exerted total control over information. In fact, the most severe countries like North Korea are most against social media because social media does have a positive effect of democratizing information in a way never before seen in history. Even in the US, early media empires threatened some of these same concerns with moguls like William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. For better or worse, there's simply no longer the same emphasis on authority, and non-authorities can now more easily scale their opinions if they're if they're opinions that are desirable and are able to thus spread across the population. Today, our concern is over the curation of information, but historically, media groups have controlled both curation and creation of information. And you better believe it allowed them to manipulate society back then as well. Propaganda is not a new thing, nor is manipulation of the masses. Sensationalism has always had a place in the press, and conspiracies were common throughout history. So my take is that some of the statements go a little too far. They divide up the accusations into a flurry of topics, but some of the key ones that I pulled out include number one, social media creates echo chambers for people to share ideas that reinforce one another rather than challenge or tamper one another. Number two, social media is incentivized to share the most engaging content, which is often not the most truthful or moderate positions. Three, the addiction becomes a mental health concern as people create a dependency on the positive feedback. And four, society has never faced a change like this and may not be able to handle it. Starting with the echo chambers, this is my biggest concern of all, and I do believe this threat is very real. What's different today is something the internet really kicked off before social media ever entered the stage, which was an increasing move toward tribalism, where people were able to gather together based on interest and reinforce one another. Unlike physical locations that were barriers historically to people gathering, virtual location is much easier to scale and more quickly can move people into areas where they will not counter different ways of thinking or news that ultimately deflates rather than excites their interests. That's another real threat, that there is no incentive to provide content that de-escalates or brings people back to a more moderate position on anything. It's also understated how much of this is in people's control. In fact, it may be argued that there is at least as much control in rewarding a business with your attention as there is with your purchases. Perhaps most concerning was the reference to the studies that show the effect of manipulating moral and political thoughts through curating information, even through things like rank ordering of search engine results. Again, the press has always been in control of this, but there's an additional impact from curating information for billions of people in a more personalized and scalable way. The addiction and mental health concerns are also reasonable, but contain ridiculous visualizations, in my opinion, that are made to feel more invasive than they actually are in reality. Working with personal information on half the households of this country, I can testify that the scenes of people personally watching and investigating an individual and intentionally manipulating one person is basically never the case. It would be extremely unprofitable for a business to invest even several minutes of a highly paid data scientist's time to get someone to engage in a 4-cent ad. The interest is basically only useful if it's able to scale to at least thousands of people, usually a lot more. And for any large business, personally identifiable information is a risk that only those with special needs are able to access. This does not mean that there should be no concerns for who has the information and maintain strong accountability, especially given data breaches or times that information gets in the hands of those who have bad intentions. But the image of your own personal Facebook employee dedicated to following your life is extremely unrealistic. There is a sense in which addiction is also a real problem, but I see no way of making it less engaging. And when it comes to the role of testing, the social dilemma makes probably its biggest overstatement. They use language like poking and prodding a spider to watch how it moves, or being like a lab rat, or living in the Matrix in one of those pods. It's a ridiculous comparison. So when these tests are being done, they're not lying or harming you to watch a response. That's a pretty important distinction. They're putting out 2 products or services to determine which one you will choose the most. Businesses run tests to find those optimal points where the business and the customer has the highest optimal value for one another, and they do that to maximize value to customers. Now, in rare cases, companies like Facebook have run a test to see effectively how much they can emotionally influence people. And that, as it should, have faced a lot of backlash because the intent was not to deliver more value to customers. It was more of a psychological type experiment for its own sake. I would also argue that all people are testing one another all the time to understand how each other responds in order to change their own behavior for better outcomes. And even business and marketing tests have become consistent for the past century or so. There's nothing nefarious about putting two options out there in order to see which one has greater demand. Unlike being stabbed to watch you move, the customer is in complete control over the engagement process and is able to observe, in fact, what they are getting. And again, it just puts us in a weird spot to say that the greatest and terrible concern that testing is so good now that it just makes us demand more interaction with their platform. Not that it deceives or artificially creates demand. Is this new thing more disruptive than anything else society has faced? The comparison made to the advent of the bicycle, for example, I think there are much better comparisons in this. One from further back would be the printing press, which did radically change the distribution of information and had significant impact on the scale of things like the Reformation and the decentralization of political and religious structures in Europe. Another innovation that created social concern was the modern-day mirror. There were fears over what would happen as people began to have more of an individual identity. It played a role in the massive wave of individualistic identity that swept across society. And in some ways, this change will have similar size impact on allowing instant and continuous projection in the sharing of an individual's ideas. I recall when I was growing up constantly hearing the debates on how violent video games and movies would influence young people to become more violent. And at the time, there was actually good evidence that these two things were correlated. Though violent media continued and actual violence was on a steady decline over the past couple of decades. This concern for young people and identity is especially important, and another great call out that the documentary makes. People do need to be aware that a trivial basis for your identity and worth is a problem, because clicks and likes are far from a good reason to live and die. The fact that social media plays a role in mediating relationships, whether you're using a feed or notifications, that does give them control over content that you see. That's also a great point that's being made. Anytime that you give up decisions to someone else, you give up power to that person or group. And doing that with your relationships is a really big deal. And the mechanisms do not necessarily even give you what you enjoy most, but what you demand most, which is not always healthy, like with food or anything else that we consume for that matter. So is this a helpful assistant for your relationships, or is it playing a role of a gossip, trying to get you the information that will get your attention, but not necessarily information that's true or helpful for you to know? I think that awareness is a really good start. And unlike their idea of regulating it, I think that awareness is important, even if it just increases the demand for us to have a say in the principles that moderate our information, such as being able to say, I want to be encouraged, weight that positive content a little bit more strongly whenever you're sorting it for me. Or you could say, if you want, I am a drama junkie, just send me whatever is going to grab my attention. For search or controversial topics, you should have a say in the weighting of a more balanced content if that's what you're looking for. I also noticed in the documentary they freak out over having played a role in creating an uncontrolled monster. But this fear is something that we could have of the entire world, even prior to the virtual world. Nobody completely understands the impact of each part of civilization, or even how our economy, based on relationships of trust, keeps from collapsing. No one person understands almost any business, product, or technology from end to end. So there's no reason to assume or fear the fact that this is also true of social media. But it is a good call for people to examine the high-level impact to whatever degree that we can, because bubbles do burst and other high-level misses can cause corrections that will hurt, just like the economic monsters that we create in every government system throughout the world. It was said that innovations of the past provided tools, while innovations now only use psychology against you. That is blatantly incorrect. As again, propaganda has listed as long as civilization, and business marketing has been strong science even for the past century. Shortly following the scale of consumer technologies allowing businesses to serve through innovations in travel and communications, even old tests revealed psychological lessons like how to use medium-sized product pricing to move people from small to large, learning the way to drive perception around value propositions. One difference is that it's cheaper to scale through social media, and so more efficient means of leveraging this psychology are available. Ultimately, even this new industry relies on you paying for their service or paying for goods or services that are advertised. I can't emphasize this part enough. There's not a magical way that your attention itself is being pillaged and exploited, except where you finally at some point decide to pay for something that's linked to that service. So what's the answer? Will regulation help? Would this regulation be to disallow these companies from getting your attention too well? How would that be measured? How would you define what can and can't be used to get your attention? It's not like there's a specific food compound that we can regulate here. It would be more like regulating recipes that are too good. I have serious doubts about what that regulation would look like, and at best, it just seems like it would result in less specific ads. And it seems like regulation would either have to be specific enough that there would be ways around it, or generic enough that it would be all but impossible to implement. Maybe specific tests that do not benefit customers based on demand, like testing emotional impacts or other more psychological experiments. Maybe those could have some regulation, but we need to have a realistic approach if it's going to succeed. Regulation tends to work great historically only when it challenges impacts that companies put on customers without their involvement, such as environmental rules where a company can gain profit while putting the cost of pollution onto non-customers or those who have no say in its success as customers. I'll have another episode coming up to discuss capitalism or profit-seeking and ethical AI, so be sure to be on the lookout for that if that topic interests you more. There's always a cost to mindless engagement. So I appreciate the tips that were provided for that. Being intentional about notifications that you receive, setting up times for quiet, if you believe that would be helpful to you, having thoughtful consideration for how your kids should be spending their time and inviting them into that discussion, especially as they get older. I think having ownership on their health overall and considering these things, all of these things are great to consider and intentionally rather than mindlessly engage. But here's my biggest message to you regarding the final solution to remove yourself from social media. If you're a moderate and having a moderating impact on the people around you, then consider what happens to these systems and whether or not they're really better off without you. If you know yourself to have an unhealthy obsession and you just love sharing untrue information and you just want to gain popularity and attention, then maybe you should pull out and delete your accounts. But if the result of this will be the same as every other time a disgruntled group of common sense or concerned people have pulled out of a system, it will lose their influence and lean even more heavily into that direction of concern because that's all that's left to drive the engine. Thank you again for hearing out my thoughts on The Social Dilemma, a documentary that's caused some great conversations that I think are likely to continue far into the future. If you enjoyed today's talk, then go ahead and hit the like button. Or if you'd like to be notified of future content, then go ahead and subscribe. Other than that, have a great day.